everyone. Welcome to a very special podcast titled The Legacy of Rugrats. I'm here with a very special guest that you may know of. He has been in the Rugrats Passover commentary, as well as alongside with Joe and Celebahair, whom we've had almost 2 years ago. We have Paul Germain. Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you.
So, yes, the 25th anniversary of Rugrats. It's just been so crazy about how far that the show has come since then. I mean, it just started off, very simple in the early 90s, and then over time it just blossomed and became a huge phenomenon, and even still to this day, people are still remembering it.
Yeah, which is great. It's exciting to know that it's had such a great effect on people and that it's stuck with them all these years.
Now, I want to know, a little bit of the back history of Rugrats that you remember. I know that we briefly discussed about this when you and Joe came into our podcast a few years ago, but I want to know from your perspective on, what was like the first, origins of Rugrats?
Well, I think I may have told you this story before, but the way that this happened was. The night we were about to pitch to Nickelodeon in the late summer of 1989, I had just come to work for Klasky Chupo as director of development, which there was kind of a misunderstanding. I thought my job was to find artists and material, but it turned out that what my job was to create material. And the night before the pitch that we were going to have with Nickelodeon, when I had all my projects prepared to pitch, Arlene Klasky came to me and she said, "I've got an idea for a show." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I want to do a show about babies." And I said, "Well, what about babies?" And she said, "Babies, they're really cute. They run around. We could do a show called One Something where it's like what it's like, it didn't make any sense. It didn't seem like an idea for a show. It sounded like a topic, right? Let's do a show with babies. Okay. So I said, she didn't know what she wanted to do with that. And I thought, wow, what am I going to do with that? Because I can't just go in and say to Nickelodeon, I want to do a show about babies. I have to have an idea, a concept. And I thought, what would I do with this? So that night, this is the night before the pitch, I went to sleep thinking, babies. What do I think about babies? And I am the oldest of four boys. And my, no sisters. And my youngest, I remember when my youngest brother, who's 8 years younger than I am, came home from the hospital. So I'm an 8-year-old kid, and I kind of go into his room, and nobody else is there. And I'm looking at this little infant, who can't lift his head and is drooling, and his eyes aren't focusing. And I look at him, and I'm thinking of my other brothers, and I'm thinking, man, he cannot be that stupid.
Wow.
Like a little kid's thought, how could this, that he must... He can't think, I can't believe it. That's not what my brothers are like. And I thought, I bet he's faking us out. I bet when we leave the room, suddenly becomes cognizant, and he jumps up and he starts running around and doing stuff and talking. I just had that little kid thought, like maybe he's hiding it from us, right? Mm-hmm. And so I woke up thinking about that. And then later that day, I have the pitch, right? And so I go in and I'm pitching all my shows to Vanessa Coffey, who was the Nickelodeon executive who had come to our studio looking for animated projects. And I had, 10 project ideas I was going to pitch. So my first idea, I have a whole bunch of artwork for it. And, let's say I have 3 or 4 beautifully designed pitch boards, and I have, 2 pages of description of what the show is and the characters. And I pitch it to her, and she says, no, that's not for us. And so I go to my next idea. And let's say I have 1 page of description and maybe 1 colored board. No, she doesn't like that one either. I go to my next idea. And this one I have half a page of description and 1 black and white drawing board. She doesn't like that either. So now I'm down to my 1 paragraph concepts, and I'm pitching those, and she's not liking any of those. And finally, I get to my very last idea, which I only have 1 sentence about. And I said, okay, a bunch of incognizant babies. They can't do anything. But the minute the adults leave the room, the babies come to life, and it turns out they can talk. And she said, I love it. And that's how Rugrats was sold.
It's kind of funny because I do remember Vanessa discussing about this in a previous interview with Matthew Klickstein about that. There was a pitch about like babies around Thanksgiving. Was that same pitch, or was that something completely different?
No, we talked about, that was the pitch. It was around that time. We may have even been thinking about doing a Thanksgiving-themed episode, but and maybe we did eventually. I don't even remember, but we certainly didn't do it at that time.
Yeah, I believe it was Nickelodeon's Thanksgiving Fest, in which that was supposed to be Nickelodeon's first foray into animation.
Okay.
And yeah, Vanessa was talking about, like, there were some things that were cut that we wanted to present, but, we just didn't do it. And one of them was about talking babies around Thanksgiving.
Oh, that's, I don't remember Thanksgiving, but she could be right. Maybe we did talk about that. I don't remember.
That's okay.
I do remember the pilot that we ended up doing for them starting later that year. We started writing it and producing it later in 1989, and eventually finished the pilot, I think, in early 1990 is my memory.
Mm-hmm. And the pilot that
had nothing to do with Thanksgiving.
Yeah, the pilot that did come out was called Tommy Pickles and the Great White Thing, and I saw it recently because I'm going to be discussing about it, and it's very different. Well, not totally different, but there are some major differences compared to what the TV show would be. Like, the way that the animation is portrayed is a tad bit different, and also Tommy's voiced by I believe her name is Tammy Holbrook instead of E.G. Daily. And
that's right. She was the first Tommy. We replaced her with E.G. Daily pretty quickly, and there's a version of the pilot with E.G.'s voice dubbed in playing Tommy, because we ended up replacing her way before we went on air. So Tammy's voice never was actually in the broadcast shows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then of course there was the person who directed it, Peter Chung. He would help with Rugrats, and then eventually went off to do Aeon Flux, and then I believe that the parents that Stu and Dee Dee were talking to, I believe they were kind of like the earliest incarnations of Betty and Howard, because Phil and Lil are there, but we don't see Betty and Howard. But
that's right.
But Stu and Dee Dee are talking to a man and a woman, and I believe there was I believe that Stu wasn't called I'm sorry, Grandpa Lou wasn't called Grandpa Lou. He was called Stu Pickles Sr. or something.
Gosh, I don't even remember that, but you're probably right.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was in the credits I've read. It was either...
Okay, yeah, I don't think he's named...
Yeah, he's not named that.
Right, I think in the show they say they don't actually call him by name. I think Stu says Pop,
yeah,
or something
exactly.
like that, addresses him. That's or Dad, but I don't think he mentions him in any... He doesn't name him, so we probably had a name in the credits. I can't remember.
Yeah, it wasn't the credits, and his name was Stu Pickles Sr.
The idea of the pilot was to demonstrate the idea of how exciting mundane things in the world are to little babies. Like, what would be mundane to us would be exciting to them. So this toilet becomes this godlike figure that Tommy's trying to communicate with, and that was the idea for the episode. And when I wrote it with a guy named Ben Herndon, we only created the characters we needed to tell that story. So Tommy's there, this intrepid kid baby who wants to find out what this toilet's about, and then he has these friends, Phil and Lil, who function the way Phil and Lil do in the series. They're kind of like an audience to Tommy. They're like somebody to go, wow, I don't know what that is, and make a few jokes, but they don't have really strong personalities, right?
Right.
So that's, and then you have Grandpa, and you have Stu and Dee Dee, and you have Spike, but you don't have any of the other characters. They didn't exist. We only created the characters we needed to tell that story. And I love that pilot. I'm very proud of it. It's really exciting and crazy. And Peter Chung, who is one of the best animators around, did an amazing job of directing the visuals in that, making it work. So I'm very proud of it, but it was just a demonstration of what the idea was. It wasn't really going into what the characters would be and the stories would be later on, because that's not what we were trying to do. We were just trying to sell that concept, which it did. They showed that to kids to kids across the country. It got huge rave reviews. I don't mean on television. They were testing it. The tests came out fantastically, and Nickelodeon picked up the show. But once they did that, then we had to come up with what we needed to make a whole series, which is different from what you need to do a little 6-minute pilot that just sells the concept.
Yeah. I completely understand. And looking back on the pilot, I mean, there are some things that would carry over to the series, and then there were some things that were changed, obviously, but I think they were changed for the better because they were able to expand more, and they were able to tweak out any problems that may have been there, but you were able to, you and the other artists and animators and writers were able to see about, okay, what should we keep in the pilot and what should we take away from the pilot? Okay, let's take this, and let's see what we can do for this. And I think it worked out for the better.
Thank you. Well, I want to say to you that more than it being, about taking anything away, it was about expanding it. Because what was there was right. It was all the ideas that we were going to use. I mean, it was a lot of the ideas that we were going to use later. There was nothing in it that needed to be taken away. But in order to do a series, a whole television series, you need a lot of characters to interact, and you need conflict between those characters. The pilot is just about Tommy kind of battling with an inanimate object. Right. It's like Tommy faces the world. But the series had to be not just that, but it had to be conflict between characters. It had to be characters pushing and pulling in different directions in order to make a series that's going to go, as long as Rugrats did, more than a decade.
Sure.
And so we had to expand, yeah.
Of course. And so I know that you've talked various interviews, including our own, about where some of the characters came from, like, excuse me, like, Tommy was inspired by, I believe, Arlene's son, and...
well, let me correct that. Arlene says it was inspired by her son, but actually, in my opinion, it was inspired by my son, whose name was Tommy.
Oh, please.
Yes, I have a son named Tom. He's now 27 years old and a student at Columbia. When I pitched the show, I was basing the character on my son, and that's why I named him Tommy.
Okay, yes, because, I mean, of all the interviews that I've heard from Arlene, she always says, I based it off of my son Brandon, so...
she may have thought of it that way. I guess the thing she always talks about is the way Tommy walks, and the way Tommy walks is significant, I guess. But I would like to think that there's more to Tommy than the way he walks.
Sure.
There's a personality there, and that didn't have anything to do with her son, who I had met, but I wasn't basing the character on and what Tommy's personality was, who he was. I wasn't basing that on her son.
Okay, fair enough. And I believe that the likeness of Chucky, like the way he looked, was based off of Mark Mothersbaugh. And
no, that is false.
Okay,
Mark Mothersbaugh. He was involved in the. I don't know where that came from. I think Mark imagined that, but the character was designed. The character for Chucky was a design that Gabor Chupo had somewhere that he came up with. It was never based on. It wasn't based on him. The personality wasn't based on him. The way that Chucky talks isn't based. It had nothing to do with him.
No. I was talking about like the physical look, like the hair and the glasses.
No.
Oh no. Okay.
No, and Mark doesn't have it.
Okay. Who was it based off?
It wasn't based on any particular person. Here's what happened. When you're writing something, you don't. Some people start with visually designed characters, and they work. And then they come up with personalities to fit those characters. I started with ideas of what kinds of characters I needed to interact with this main character that I'd already defined. So Tommy is supposed to be this intrepid leader, right? He's a baby. He's like an explorer going out into the world, taking risks and going after something. That's what Tommy is all about. So I thought, okay, what's the opposite of that? Because when you're coming up with TV shows and movies, for that matter, any kind of dramatic work, any kind of narrative work, you have to come up with opposites. You say, okay, well, what do I need, right? So if I've got a guy who always wants to explore this exciting but yet scary world out there, I wanted a character who was going to be the opposite of that, who was always going to be, the exact opposite of an explorer, a guy who was scared of the world, who was afraid, who was reluctant, who doesn't want to go out and explore. So I wanted his sidekick, Tommy's sidekick, to be the opposite of Tommy, a guy who's just like, I don't think that's a good idea, Tommy. And that's how we came up with Chucky, right? And then once we come up with the character, we thought, well, what would this little guy look like? And we thought, well, he's a little scaredy cat guy. We thought, I have glasses, but we thought, well, it'll make him look a little more, like a fearful little guy if he has glasses on. And we thought he's got buck teeth, he's got these 2 teeth because they're the only 2 teeth he's got because he's a baby, right? His teeth have just come in, so he's got just 2. And he's all about a depiction of a fearful, reticent person. And that's what Chucky's about.
Okay. Well, thank you for the correction. I guess maybe there was like one interview with Mark saying that it was, Chucky's likeness was based off of him. So I apologize.
I don't know where he got that, but it isn't true.
Okay. And now, as for Phil and Lil, I don't know if we asked you about where they came from. I know you kind of called them like, that you kind of described them as like, they're like your aunt and uncle if they were like really goofy or something like that. So,
no, what I said was, I think that's a misunderstanding. Phil and Lil were the names Phil and Lil. I wanted to have, my initial idea was I wanted to have twins, right? Identical twins, except they were of different sexes. Now, if you know the truth and science behind identical twins, they have to be the same gender. But the joke is that they're not. So there are these twin babies who are of different genders, which was the joke, right? That was the concept. And then Arlene suggested, well, why don't we name them Phil and Lil? Because she had an uncle and an aunt named Phil and Lil. And we thought those were funny names. So we named them after that uncle and aunt. That's where the names came from. But what Phil and Lil's personalities were about, they started in the pilot being, people that Tommy could discuss his ideas with, right?
Right.
So they were people he could talk to in the pilot. As the series progressed, Phil and Lil became kind of 2 things. We called them, I remember Peter Gaffney called them the peanut gallery. They were always commenting on things, right? They didn't have, their personalities didn't specifically go to the issue of intrepid explorers, except that they're like nuts. They'll do anything. They're really crazy and they'll do anything. That's kind of what their personalities are. As characters in the show, they're not the main character. The center of the show is Tommy. The 2 most important characters beyond Tommy are Angelica and Chucky, who didn't exist in the pilot. Chucky's the reticent friend who's always trying to pull Tommy back, and Tommy has to pull him along, but their friendship is a key in the show. And then Angelica is the villain. Angelica is the character who is all, she's a little older, so she can talk. She's the only character who can talk of the babies, who can talk to the adults and can talk to the babies. No one else can do that. And so she understands both worlds, and she uses that knowledge to control both groups, right? And she's like the meanest little girl there is, but she's all peaches and cream to the adults, but mean to the kids when the adults aren't looking. So she's kind of villainous. And some people had problems with that. They said, she's too mean. We used to hear that all the time. Arlene Klasky always said, Angelica's too mean. And we'd say, the whole point of Angelica is to be mean. She's the villain. And that was kind of a key to the show. And that ended up being what Angelica was. This kind of exciting, strong, powerful character who misled the kids often on purpose, and gave them the wrong information about the world. And so she's the kind of I don't know what, she's like an aggressive antagonist in the show, and she functions great. A lot of great comedy comes out of her.
Right. I have a friend named, I have a friend who actually is a huge fan of Angelica. Angelica is actually his favorite character.
Angelica was a favorite character of many kids over the years. I remember that she was sort of a symbol of girl power for a few years back there in the 90s. we'd get letters from people whose daughters, young girls were saying, yeah, I can be powerful and strong and I can stand up and I can do things. So she became kind of an avatar for strong girls, which I thought was really exciting. So yeah, she's a lot of people's favorite character. She's powerful and she doesn't care.
Exactly.
She's a lot of fun. Villains, are often the most fun characters.
Yeah, I think that's for the case for a lot of people, in which they always like the villain characters because they think that the heroes can sometimes be a little bit boring, but villains are more fascinating. They have more complexity.
Yeah.
All right. Now, can you recall any? When you guys decided to bring in the people who were eventually going to voice the characters for Rugrats? Like,
Yes.
were there any were there any instances in which when you listened to the auditions for all the characters, you were like, okay, I feel that this could be Tommy or this can be Chucky, and so on and so forth?
Well, the way we cast the show is we were looking for specific voices for this. I mean, we were casting for specific characters, so people would come in to play, to do voices for Tommy, or they'd come in to do voices for Chucky, or they'd come in to do voices for Phil and Lil, or the parents, and we had specific days. We had sides for each of the characters, and we would bring people in. Generally speaking, we would be concentrating on one character at a time, and thinking of voices just for that character and saying, okay, who are the people that auditioned for this? The one exception to that was that Chris Kavanaugh, I remember, came in and she just blew us away. She was so great. And at one point, we had already decided that Nickelodeon had decided they wanted us to replace the voice for Tommy, the original voice that you heard in the pilot, because they felt that that the voice sounded too much like an adult woman and not enough like a little kid. And so we were looking very hard for someone to replace Tommy. And at a certain point, Chris Kavanaugh had come in and had auditioned for Tommy, and I loved her voice. I knew I loved her voice and her acting. She was an amazingly talented person. But we decided she would be better for Chucky because she could bring that heartfelt, struggle in her voice that is just amazing. And so she ended up playing Chucky, and Chucky is in many ways one of my favorite characters in the show. E.G. Daly came in to do Tommy, and E.G. Daly is a stunning voice tone. She could, and it was the first time, she told me it was the first time she'd ever done voices in animation. She's gone on to do a lot of animation, but at the time she had never done that. She was a singer, and she came in and her ability to do Tommy was amazing. She had this gritty quality to her voice that I just loved. It really had this scrappy kind of feel to it that was great for Tommy. And she was an amazing actress, and she could do vocal effects and like a yell or a grunt or like a sound would go like, ooh, when you fall down, that kind of thing. She was great at that. And so, she was a fantastic Tommy. The adults I had gone after, I remember that I could go on and on about that, but that's the start of that conversation.
Sure. I mean, a lot of the people who would go on to voice for Rugrats, like E.G. Daly, Kath Soucie, Chris Kavanaugh, Tress MacNeille, Michael Bell, so many people have, they're incredibly talented, yeah.
Yeah.
So with Rugrats, I mean, at that, with a concept like Rugrats, I mean, you needed to, try to see if you can make this kind of idea work. So, I mean, for a lot of people, when they remember Rugrats, it's kind of like in those cases in which not only did the kids like it, but also the adults liked it. So, one thing that I actually noticed when rewatching Rugrats again are all the little pop culture references that Rugrats had, like referencing a lot of movie quotes and, things in the background, or even referencing movie scenes, or, for the adults, it's like, they're going through raising a child, I was raising my own children and stuff like that. So how was it that, for Rugrats, you wanted to cater to the adults just as much as the children? Because, for a lot of cartoons, it was like, oh, cartoons are for kids and stuff like that. It's like, I think with, many shows, including Rugrats that came out at the time, it's like, no, we can be able to target both demographics. It doesn't have to be like this one-way thing. It can be for every...
I had come off of working on the Simpson 1-minute cartoons on the old Tracy Ullman show, and one of the reasons that Nickelodeon had come to us in 1989 and that summer was that The Simpsons was about to come out as a series, and it was the first primetime animated series in 25 years. The last one had been The Flintstones. And Nickelodeon was excited about that. It was now clear to the world that animation could appeal to adults also. But that was a new idea. If you'd asked people 10 years before that, or even 2 years before that, they would have said, no, cartoons are for little kids. They're not for adults. We knew differently. One of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to design the show so it could appeal to children and their parents, right? And the way I wanted to appeal to the parents was that there's two worlds in Rugrats. There's the world of the adults and the world of the kids, and they're very divided up. And neither of them understands the other one. They're both clueless about the other one, especially the parents about the kids. Now, that fit into a theme that Nickelodeon was very interested in at the time, which was your parents don't know anything, kids. They're dumb. You're the ones who understand things. That was a Nickelodeon theme at that time for the whole network. And so the way we decided to play that was that Stu and Dee Dee, especially Dee Dee, were always coming up with these parenting skills that they were going to show, that they were going to try to parent these babies. And they were always wrong, Everything the parents do is wrong. It's part of the joke of the show, right? They just don't get it, right? And that was a fun thing to play out. So in some ways, especially for my writers at the time, me and my writers were all, young people who had just had kids. Almost all of us were new parents at that time. And we were trying to figure out how to raise children and making mistakes. And we thought, well, what a great thing to parody. What a great thing to discuss in the context of the show about babies. And so we would sort of make fun of ourselves and make fun of people we knew who were trying all these, fad, baby ideas, raising children ideas at the time. That's how Lipschitz comes in. He's kind of a parody of, pop psychologists who know all the answers and have a technique for raising children. It was a way of making fun of that.
Yeah, like so like those advice columns like like Abby or Dear Abby, or like those baby books like Dr. Spock, which were like big in the late 80s.
More the second than the first. It was more about like actual child raising techniques that were popular at that time. If we were doing it now, you could do the same things. There's always fads in parenting that people talk about and they argue about. Is it right to do it this way or that way, or do you take away television, or do you leave it on? All that kind of stuff. It's all fodder for us to play with when we were coming up with stories for the show. But it would always be the B plot, whatever dumb thing the adults were doing that really didn't lead to anything.
Right, and for the there's a lot of moments for the adults in which they do various things that kind of are questionable, like for the there's the scene in which let's see, it was the Pickles versus the DeVilles, in which they're constantly arguing with each other all the time over some stupid thing, and then they stay away from one another. Stu even builds a wall, like a big fence, and then the kids just can't take it anymore, so they just, go off into the side while they're still arguing with one another. And then they realize, oh, the kids are gone, and now they're just realizing, oh, wow, we're supposed to be watching over our kids. That's the most important thing, not this stupid argument.
Right.
So,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so when did it first occur to everybody that Rugrats had became like a massive hit?
Well, the interesting thing is that it was always popular and was always doing well from the moment it went on the air. And Nickelodeon considered it a great success, and we won 3 Emmys during the initial run of 65 half hours. But it didn't become a giant hit until after those 65 half hours had been finished, and then a couple of years later. So we finished production in 1992 or 93. I think 93 production was over, and we all went our separate ways. And then in 1995, Nickelodeon decided to to put a block of their original cartoons in prime time. Before that, they'd been showing them during the day, but not at prime time. And once they put them in they put Rugrats in prime time, it really took off and became a giant hit. But the rest, but my writers and I, the original people who ran the show and made it in the original 65, we'd all gone our separate ways by then. We're doing different things. I wasn't working with Klasky Csupo, nor were any of my writers. Not a single writer from the original 65 half hours of Rugrats continued on into the stuff that was produced after that.
Oh, now what are your favorite episodes of Rugrats?
Well, there's a lot of them. There's I think my favorite episode is probably one called Chucky versus the Potty, which is about Chucky getting potty trained. That was written by Joanne Soliver, who's a very close friend of mine still. And it really hit the idea of what it's like to be a little kid and dealing with something you're afraid of. That was Joe's specialty as a writer. He did a lot of those episodes. That's one of my favorites. Another one is Angelica Breaks a Leg, which was written by a guy named Steve Vixton, who's passed on. Steve's idea was, he said, I love this character, Angelica. She's such a spoiled little brat. I want to do fun stuff with her. And he wrote this episode where she fakes breaking her leg, and Stu is forced to take care of her, and she manipulates him. And there's a line in the episode, which I still see quoted on the internet, and it's probably the funniest line we ever did, where Angelica demands that he bring her some pudding. And he says, Angelica, it's the middle of the night. I'm not getting you pudding. And she said, please. And he says, forget it, Angelica. I'm not getting you pudding. And then you cut to him at a store going, where's the instant pudding? And it's like midnight, and then you cut to him, and his eyes are all bleary, and it's like 2 a.m, and he's cooking at the stove. And Dee Dee walks in, and she goes, Stu, what are you doing? And he says, I'm making pudding, making instant pudding. And she goes, it's the middle of the night. Why are you making instant pudding? And he says, because I've lost control of my life. And I think that's maybe the funniest line we ever did in the show.
It's true, because I have seen that line so many times. They've made memes out of it. They've made questionable videos about it. But yes, the guy who did that line the guy who came up with that line is a writer named Steve Vixton, and he died a few years ago, but it was one of the funniest things we ever did. He was a brilliant writer. Yeah. And we did.
There's other episodes. There's the Passover episode. We're really proud of that. The story behind that was that Nickelodeon came to us and asked us to do a Christmas episode, which we did, and it was successful. And the next year they came to us and said, could you do a Hanukkah show? And I said, well, let me get to my people, and I'll get back to you. And we talked. The writers in the room, and a couple of us, me included, are Jewish. And we were talking, and we said, Hanukkah's a perfectly fine holiday, but Hanukkah was never a major holiday in Judaism. It's an important holiday, but it isn't the big one. The big one is Passover. And so we called Nickelodeon back and said, look, instead of doing a Hanukkah episode, let us do a Passover episode, because that's the really important thing. And so Nickelodeon said, okay, do that. And so we did that Passover episode, which has become kind of a classic for people. People use it to teach their kids about Passover. And our idea there was to communicate an idea that's kind of, I think in some ways, unique to that holiday and the way that Jewish people approach it, which is you can tell the story many different ways. It's not really fixed. That's why, we go in and tell it in this silly way with Angelica being Pharaoh and Tommy being Moses, because you can tell that, and Grandpa telling the story in the attic where they all get locked in. It's because the story can be told in many different ways and still communicate this idea of freedom. And that was what we wanted to sort of teach our audience. And it's kind of worked out.
Yeah, it definitely did work out. And, we even talked about this when you were a guest on our podcast a few years ago, but myself, Kevin, and Christina, we said that was how we were first introduced to the holiday, was watching the Passover special.
Well, that's really cool. I love that.
All right. So, what was the idea on the music that you wanted to present with Rugrats? Because I know that you had Mark Mothersbaugh and you had another composer. So, how did you guys get the music together that would fit well with the show?
Well, the other composer is a guy named Dennis Hannigan, and Mark had hired him. I didn't actually know that he was working on the show. Mark was using him to do some of the work in the series, and so I would just meet with Mark every week. Once I had the show, we had a locked picture. Do you know what that means?
No, I don't.
Well, in other words, you get you do an edit of the show, and you lock what the picture is going to look at with the dialogue track. And then once you've got that, that's kind of what the show is going to be. But it doesn't have sound effects in it yet. It just has dialogue and picture. And then you take it to a post-production house, and you say, here are the sound effects I want to be in this world, and you describe that. And then you meet with the music guy, and you say, here's how I want the music to go. This is a very dramatic moment. I want music to kind of come in here and kind of do something here and then go out there throughout the entire show, right? And so I would meet with Mark, and I would tell him what I wanted. And then a few days later, he'd call me up, and he'd have an initial run of the music ready. I'd come and listen to it and make changes. And then he would go away and make those changes. Some of them he could do on the spot because it was all done electronically.
Okay. And here's my next question. What is Grandpa Lou's obsession with the number 15?
Oh, we were just making a joke about 15 years. It was just a joke about how, when you're a kid, old people are always telling you they had to walk 1,000,000 miles in the snow, to get to school. It was just kind of the 15 wasn't the significant thing. We just liked the sound of it. So it was mostly just about, I have to walk 15 miles in the snow.
Oh, I get it.
School,
Yeah, I get it. So it was just not the number, it was just to emphasize on something.
It was to emphasize the idea that you guys have it easy. We had it tough, that older people are always telling you when you're a kid.
Okay. All right. My third question is, let's see. What was I going to say? Hold on. I had this right here. Oh, yeah. Okay. So my third question is, did any of now you were saying earlier that a lot of the experiences with one of the reasons why that the grown-ups were able to be relatable for a lot of the people who watched the show is because you guys were parents yourselves and you were raising your own kids. Were there any episodes that related to that the most, maybe for you or maybe for some of the other writers?
About being kids?
About raising your own kids.
It was mostly, more than it was about the experience of raising our own kids. For us, it was more about the experience of being kids. It was more about our memories from being kids and what it was like. So some of the writers on the show didn't have kids. A lot of them did, but some of them didn't. And I did, and Joe did, but our kids were very small at the time. When I finished Rugrats, my oldest child was 4 years old, So some of the experiences of raising kids we brought into the show, but mostly what we were talking about, especially from the A plot, which would be about what the babies were experiencing, was our own memories of being a little kid and what it was like. So it was more about being kids than it was about being parents. The parent part that we dealt with had to do with Stu and Dee Dee being so confused about having kids and not knowing what to do, right? And being confused about child rearing and going crazy about that. That we kind of referred to from our own lives. But from the kids stuff, we were kind of going from, not from our point of view of our kids, but from our point of view of remembering when we were kids.
Okay. And another question that I had was, let me see. When the Passover special first came out, we talked about this when we did the Passover commentary. There were a lot of positive discussions about it, but then there were a lot of, people who were kind of thinking that it was portraying, the characters as stereotypes. So what was the story behind that?
Try that one more time. I'm sorry.
There were some negative remarks from people discussing about like the way that the characters were portrayed, like when the Passover special came out. So, what was the story behind that? Because I didn't hear about this other than the slime book.
Are you talking about people saying that they were bothered by Jewish stereotypes?
Yeah, like when the Passover special first came out.
What's interesting is I never heard any of that stuff when the Passover special came out. I only heard about that years later.
Yeah, I heard about that recently when they were discussing about the book, like when you guys were interviewed with Matthew about the book. I never even heard about this, and I was surprised.
I had heard about it years later when I was not working on Rugrats anymore. I heard that some people felt that Grandpa Boris and Grandma Mina were Jewish stereotypes, which always annoyed me because I was basing them on my own grandparents. So for me, they weren't stereotypes; they were my grandparents.
I never really noticed anything, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. I guess we'd have to ask them, but they don't seem like stereotypes to me. They seem, although I remember the design of Grandma, I always thought was she looked like a little generic grandma, but not necessarily Jewish.
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, at times she kind of looks like my own grandmother.
Yeah, so I don't know what people were referring to there. To me, I was just doing, I was doing my memory of my own grandparents.
Okay, and now one final question that I had was with Angelica, and you were saying earlier about how she was like a role model to a lot of girls and stuff like that, and you were talking earlier about like when for some people, maybe they thought that with Drew and Charlotte, the way that they raised Angelica, do you think that maybe how do you think Angelica would be like in this day and age if she were treated more or less the same?
Patricia, I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you get closer to the microphone or something? Because your voice is so echoey, I can't make out what you're saying.
Okay, I'm here. Is that better?
Yeah, could you try the question again? Because I just couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay, sure. I was just saying the question about, like, go ahead. You can. The babies would, and especially in the first season, we get into a lot of mischief and trouble. And, were there ever any, particularly like in the first season, did you know, like, when you did the first season in which the babies would do this and that, and then eventually, like, later on, they started using more of their imaginations, they started interacting more with the people. It's like, when did you decide that, we wanted to take this, we wanted to take the concept of just, babies, just going through, like, a whole bunch of mayhem, either destroying stuff or wandering around without their parents knowing, to let's focus more on the imaginations and the adventures. Like, episodes in which, you have Tommy and Angelica and the babies pretending that they're pirates, or thinking that their garage is the moon, and the box in which they think it's a TV, and then the home movies where they pretend to have their own home movie. So where did more of the imagination come in?
Well, here's the thing. I would actually divide it a little differently than you did. Let me say this. When we first, as I mentioned to you, I think last time, when we were first doing the show, we were concentrating on the babies go to some place and wreak havoc. And every episode was that. We got bored with that pretty quickly. But we didn't even get through, we were only like a short way through the first season when we started. My partner Joe reminded me of this. He was my head writer at the time. And he reminded me that we were barely through the first season when we started experimenting with more things having to do with philosophical ideas or imagination. So one of the episodes that we did that with, which is really early, it's like the 4th, 5th episode, something like that, is Real Robots, which was the episode where Tommy and Chucky decide, Tommy comes to the conclusion that what if everything's pretend and, nobody's real and they're all there to test him, which was something that we thought was really funny. We remembered having that thought when we were kids. And so they go on this quest to figure out if that's true. And that's like the first one where it's all about imagination. It's not about like going to a baseball game and wreaking havoc or something like that. And that we were doing, that's like early in the first season. By the end of the first season, we had really developed several different ideas. Like one of them was we wanted to do shows about the kids' imagination. So like the Pirates episode or the trial episode where they put on a trial to see who killed Tommy's clown lamp or various other things. We started doing that before we finished the first season, and then we really did it a lot in the second season. We also did episodes where we put together combinations of characters to see what would happen. So what if Angelica and Chucky get handcuffed together? And what would that be like? These two really opposite types. Or Phil and Lil decide they don't want to be brother and sister anymore. And so they have a fight and they don't want to be brother and sister. We started putting different combinations of characters together. We started doing those imagination episodes like the pirate episode. We started doing, I'm trying to think of what other things we did. We do like emotional episodes with Chucky where he's trying to conquer some fear that he had. So these are all things that we started doing, as I say, at the like halfway or 3/4 of the way through the first season, and that is really what the show became.
So, now, after, when you saw that Rugrats became a success, and then when the writers were no longer a part of Rugrats, I want to know, in your personal opinion, eventually when, they continued on with the franchise, and they, did the movies, and then they did the spin-off series and stuff like that, how would you have imagined, with, you and the original writers and all that, and, if everything was to, be, stay intact. How do you feel like your version of a Rugrats movie, or how the characters would have been if they grew up? I mean, how do you perceive it as?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me.
I'm saying there were the three Rugrats movies, but you and the writers were not a part of it. But I'm saying how would you write a Rugrats movie? Or
well, look, here's what I think about when you're writing a movie based on your series. I think the people who wrote the movie didn't understand the series. I don't think they knew what it is we were saying. I remember there's a scene in the first movie where Stu goes to Tommy and he says, "Tommy, you're the man of the family now. Here's a watch." And he hands him like a pocket watch. And I'm thinking, what? That's not Rugrats. The parents and the kids don't speak to each other. The parents don't recognize the intelligence that the kids have. He would never do that. They didn't understand what the series was. And I think the plot, I can't even remember what the plot was of that movie. It didn't make any sense to me at all. And it still doesn't. I don't know what it means. I know people liked it. I think that it's a statement about how strong the series was, that it could survive that poor of a story. Because I don't think the story made any sense. And, I think that, and then what they did with the series with that, that little French girl and Tommy having a baby brother. If Tommy has a baby brother, then he's not a baby anymore. Someone else is the baby. And now he's running around acting like a big brother to somebody else who's the baby. Now he's not a baby anymore, and the story doesn't make sense. It's not a story about these suddenly cognizant, these cognizant babies. It's now a story about being a big brother. It just stopped being about the series stopped being about what it was. And people would, I know some of the writers who came along after us, they would make too much of mispronouncing words. They didn't understand how we were doing it. They turned it into a whole episode in a way we wouldn't have. I just think it became sort of second rate. And then when they went to All Grown Up, I thought, what? Well, if they're all grown up, then there's no story anymore. Now how is it Rugrats? It has nothing to do with Rugrats. So, I never thought any of it was, it's just not my thing. I think they sort of ruined it. But, that's just my opinion.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so in your opinion, the Rugrats should have stayed as babies, and the movies should have kept what made the original Rugrats what they were, instead of adding all these things that weren't really necessary.
Look, I think that when you're making a movie based on a TV series, I've done that. We did it with Joe and I did it with Recess. There's a way in which you can keep the heart and the core, the soul of your show, and expand it to make a movie, which has to be bigger than a TV show. I understand that. But there are ways of doing that honor what the show is, and there are ways of doing it where you just kind of throw everything away and start over again, and and when you don't really understand what it is that you've got. And I think that's what they did with the movies. So sadly, I think I wouldn't have gone in that direction. I think that once I think the reason that the show was a hit was because of the writing and the storytelling and the soul of it. And I think it was all lost after we left in 1993. I'm sorry, did you get that?
Is that my phone?
No, it's mine.
Oh, okay. Do you need to pick up a call?
Why don't we take a break for a second?
Okay. And I'm sorry, you were just finishing up your discussion.
You're going to have to refresh my memory.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, you were talking about like you and Joe doing recess and about how there's a fine line about how to adapt a TV show into a movie.
Yeah, I cannot. I think they would have done better to have let the people who ran the show and made it a giant hit continue on making it great, but they didn't. They decided not to go that way, and so I think the show suffered and the property suffered. But that's how life goes.
Okay, I understand from your perspective. I completely understand. How would you have done it?
Well, that's a complicated question. You mean how would I have written the movie?
I mean, yeah. How would you have written the movie? How do you think, in your opinion, what would the personalities of Tommy and the gang would have been like if they were older? Yeah, I would love to know that.
The answer to your question, Patricia, is I never would have made them older. Once you make them older, the show makes no sense anymore. They can't. The whole show is about newborn, not really, but not sincerely newborn babies, but babies who don't understand the world. Once they get older, you're no longer telling a story about babies who don't understand the world. They now are young kids who have some understanding of the world, and so the concept's dead. So you can't age them up. And aging them up, what I would have said to people at the time if I had been asked, was I would have said, if you make them teenagers, there is no Rugrats. You're wasting your time. And no one's – and I think, I don't know – I don't know how audiences responded to it. I look at the show and I think I just don't get it. I don't understand why anybody would have done that. But,
Okay, that's completely fair. And, all right, I guess we can – off that tangent one more time since, we're wrapping up. So, many years later when, the show became a hit, when, there was, like, so many people watching it, both kids and adults, and, now it's, stayed with many people as, like, one of the definitive classics. And I know you talked about this previously, that you have gone to many classes and seminars talking about, like, the show and stuff like that. So, I mean, are there other things that you've seen, especially more recently, that showcases about how much of an impact Rugrats have left on people?
Well, Patricia, I'm sorry, but I don't understand the question.
The legacy that I was talking about, like the impact that that you ever get any, like, whenever you go to seminars or classes, do people say like, oh, Rugrats meant a lot to me. It influenced me to go into art and animation, or I used to.
Yeah, I hear that, and I hear people saying how much it influenced them on the way that they would approach the world, the way of thinking, the way of like who they wanted to be. We talked about how Angelica was this powerful character, this powerful girl, and that I think had a big influence on. I think interestingly, that had kind of a powerful influence on girls in your generation who were looking at that and saying, hey, I can be strong and powerful. I can be tough. I can fight. I can use my fists. I can do anything, I mean, Angelica's sort of a bully, but she's kind of a cool bully. And I think she had a really interesting effect on girls. We were showing a powerful girl and we were enjoying depicting her power. And I don't think that had been done before, at least in children's animation. And that was kind of I think that's influenced a whole bunch of, women have come to me, young women have come to me and told me how much of an influence that had. And people have told me how Chucky's fearfulness and, the way he was conquering his fears, the way he kind of faced his fears, even though they were so strong, even though he was so terrified, he would face his fears and either, and learn to use the toilet or go down the slide or any of those things. I think we were sending a message, you can do it, you can face your fears and conquer them. And I think that had a big influence on children growing up at that time. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Because, even still to this day, I know people who said that, I was afraid of clowns when I was a kid, and because of Chucky, I was able to relate to that. And nowadays, I'm not so afraid anymore. Or I knew somebody like Angelica who was like really high strung, and I can relate to I can relate to all these things, even for some people, it's like, I went through a tough time and watching Rugrats made me feel a lot better, or, it got me inspired to create my own stuff. I mean, it's just amazing. And, even like going back into what we were saying about the Passover special, a lot of people were influenced by saying like, hey, there's another culture that's being represented on television. I didn't know anything about this particular holiday until I saw it on this episode. It's like, with Rugrats, I think that because the concept may have been very basic when it was first presented, it's able to influence so many people in various ages. And even still to this day, like 25 years later, people are still talking about it.
Yeah. Well, look, I had this philosophy that children ought to be given good quality entertainment, good quality storytelling, good quality comedy, and that they were going to understand it. They were smart, and they would get as much out of it as, say, adults would from a show like Taxi. I don't know if you remember that show.
Sure, yeah, I know about Taxi.
Yeah. Yeah, it was shows. We thought I got my start working for James L. Brooks, and I learned a lot from him. And one of the things I learned is how to tell funny, emotional stories, and how to create good characters to tell those stories. What that entailed, and I saw no reason why we couldn't do the same thing for children. And I don't think it had been done before that. I mean, the closest you come is some of the more sophisticated Disney movies, like, say, Dumbo, but on television, there was nothing but junk before, in terms of animation, except for like little things like the Peanuts shows. Those were great. I remember how those inspired me when I was a kid. But the stuff on Saturday morning, most of it was just junk. And there was a real jaded attitude about how to tell stories to children. We wanted to change that, and that's what we were after doing in Rugrats.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what made, partly that was what made adults really crazy about it, because a lot of the stuff around the, later part of the 70s and 80s was just, oh, we're going to sell this toy, or, oh, we're going to market this thing or whatever. And that was basically what children's entertainment was. And, because of, creator-driven content like, Rugrats, it was able to have it based on something not based off of a toy, not based off of a celebrity or a movie. It was something original. And not only was it original, but it was also creative, because, I mean, you were saying about, like, the original concept, the original title was going to be One Something, which sounds like, oh, it's like 30-something, except it's for toddlers. It's like, I mean, how many shows before Rugrats came out that was about, like, toddlers? Because I think I read somewhere in an article stating about, like, oh, if you're a kid, you have to, the main demographic that you're trying to target is, like, oh, teenagers, because it's like, oh, they think that, stuff for the older crowd for kids is cool, but it's like, no, we're going to go back into saying, like, oh, no, we're going to have a show based off of babies. It's like, that's never been done before, and, something like Rugrats was a massive hit because it was so original and it was so unique and relatable.
Yeah.
All right, now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I have one final question. Now, there's been a lot of talks lately about, like, oh, this show is coming back with a renewal or a revival or a remake or something like that. Now, Would you ever want to see Rugrats come back remade, if you were a part of it, or you don't think that, or you think that Rugrats should stay, how it is? Like,
I could go either way. I'm interested in. I would definitely be interested in doing it, but only if we could do it right. If we have to go back to the poor stuff they were doing in the late '90s, then I'm not sure it would be worth doing. If we're allowed to make it, to kind of continue doing the good work that we did in the first 65 half hours in the original series, I think it would be great. I would love to do that.
Awesome. That would be amazing. And, again, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk on this podcast. I really do appreciate it. And do you have any upcoming projects that you'd like to share for us?
I've got a couple of interesting projects I'm developing, especially one about a group of brothers that might be coming up, but I can't tell you anything more about that. There's a project that I'm involved in that I really can't talk about these, unfortunately, but there's a couple of things I got baking, that I got in the oven there, and I hope they will finish getting baked, and I'll be able to present them to you next time we talk.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is it for this podcast. Please let us know in the comments below about your memories of Rugrats. What are your favorite episodes? Who are your favorite characters? And your favorite moments. I'd love to know. And we hope to see you soon. Take care.